Okay, thank you all for joining us for the Law and Tech panel. We're going to get started here. My name's Andrew. I'm the moderator for this session. I'll briefly introduce myself and then introduce the rest of our panelists, and we'll dive into some questions. So my background is largely in political advocacy and policy work, but lately I'd made a switch more into technology, so I'm a product manager at IBM. A graduate student at Duke University, and I'm also an advisor here at All Tech is Human. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to join us this weekend. On the panel here, starting to my right, we have Dan Wu. Dan is the privacy counsel and legal engineer at Immuta, which is an automated data governance platform. His work on legal tech, data ethics, and inclusive cities has been featured in places like TechCrunch, Harvard Business Review, Bloomberg, et cetera. And he holds a JD and a PhD from Harvard. Moving here to the middle, this is Lynette Attai. She's an expert on data privacy, user safety, and compliance. She's the founder of Playwell, a global compliance consulting firm, and she serves as a virtual chief privacy officer and GDPR data protection officer for clients around the world. She's also the author of 2 books, Student Data Privacy, Building a School Compliance Program, and a new release that's just out this year, Protecting Student Data Privacy, Classroom Fundamentals. And then on the end here, we have Mark Kanellis. He's a defender, technologist, and self-described policy wonk. He has a PhD in aerospace and cognitive engineering from Georgia Tech and is currently a law student at NYU interning with the Federal Defenders of New York. His background is as a policy staffer for a member of the US House of Representatives, but more recently, he's been fighting for human rights over technology as a co-founder of NYU student org Rights Over Tech, and he's the vice chair of IEEE USA's AI Policy Committee. So these are some real experts. They have some great insights to share with us this morning. To kick us off and just set the stage for the conversation, I'd love if each of you could speak for a couple minutes just to how you think about the relationship between law and technology. What ought that intersection to look like? How ought that intersection look, and how maybe does that sometimes differ in practice? Yeah?
Yeah, so one inspiration for me around this, as a legal engineer, I'm directly translating legal requirements into product requirements to make it easier for companies to be ethical with their data. And so one of the key components of this is how do we re-envision the lawyer's relationship in relation to technology, not as someone that just comes at the back end, at the very end, who will say no or maybe, but someone who can have that sort of ethical, tech-oriented mindset to come in the beginning of the program and to sort of embed key principles around social science and legal principles and ethical principles from the very beginning. And that really pushes forward what we call like a values-driven company. We're going to have companies that are really pushing forward for values such as privacy, human rights from the get-go. That can ultimately become a competitive business advantage for companies that are starting to think and deal with a new group of consumers who are starting to care about social impact, care about how companies' social responsibility is in the world. And so as a legal engineer, that's sort of the mindset that we bring in, is like, how do we start re-envisioning how people across different functions can work together to push forward a different vision of what a business's product or business model could be about?
So I come from it from the perspective of someone who's very much working with companies on their implementation. I often say to my clients, I'm going to sit between the lawyers and the biz dev, or the lawyers and the marketers, or the lawyers and the engineers, and I'm going to give you a plan that the lawyers are going to say yes to. I firmly believe, and have built my business on the idea, that we can make a lot of money and we can be incredibly successful while doing the right thing, that those are not diametrically opposed concepts. And I see that play out time and time again in my business. And I think part of what Daniel is articulating is this idea of privacy by design, which we throw around a lot in my industry, certainly, right? Privacy by design. And what it means is that consideration for privacy needs to be fundamental to any product development. When you are thinking about the concept at that very early stage, when it's on paper, we need to be thinking about privacy and security requirements there as well. Now that's very nice, but what it really means is we need to think about the person, right? We need to think about the user. And I think something that has gotten a little bit lost in our era of big data are some fundamentals of business, particularly business marketing. where we're thinking about the user and consideration for the user, not as a bunch of data elements, but as a person, as a human who is going to be interacting. And I think more and more we are seeing in the world of privacy by design, if you will, a realization that it's about consideration for our impact on the individual. And so that's how I look at it, and that's how my clients who come to me are starting to realize our fundamental responsibility is not to privacy or security or to these concepts, but to the person who's going to be at the other end of our product.
Yeah, so when I think of how law and tech interact, I think two things come to mind. The first is what's called the pacing problem, developed by some engineers and scientists out of Arizona State, talking about how technology and science as well, we often forget that science is also out there. Think GMOs, agriculture. Science is outpacing law and policy at rates we've never seen before. We've certainly had industrial revolutions, which caused a lot of change as well, but we're in the midst of another one. How is law and policy and ethics, philosophy, all of these things going to keep up with the fact that we can develop and deploy and scale at rates way faster than actually our institutions were designed to accommodate? And so if that's the case, if I can engineer and deploy an app that goes from 5 users to 1 billion users in a few months or a year, when our legal processes take years to do almost anything regulatory, that's going to be a problem. Also, the law is retrospective. I think people always often forget this. The law can only really protect you after bad things happen. Think in criminal law, you think with our Me Too movement, the law only comes after you've been harassed, after you've been discriminated against, after something bad has happened. So the law just fundamentally operates in a different way. And lastly, we're going to talk about this a lot in terms of how does change work. So change in technology, almost anyone can sort of enter the space of technology, build an app, build some type of business solution, or at least they think they can, right? It looks easy, and deploy it. Change in a legal sense, change in a policy sense, change in a politics sense, means building coalitions, means long-term thinking, strategies, grassroots organizations, the makeups of courts. What are courts going to deal with it? How are you going to get precedent? So also change looks very different. So I think as much as we always want tech and law people to come together, they are operating in fundamentally different spaces that requires conversations like this in order to make progress.
Great. Mark, I want to drill down on this challenge of technology outpacing the law. I think when I think of the intersection between law and technology, one of the images that comes to mind as a salient image is the recent Mark Zuckerberg hearings at the Capitol, and how disheartening it can be to hear lawmakers asking questions that sometimes just fall as silly, and the challenge of lawmakers understanding these unfamiliar technologies and their effects on society and the new systems they're creating. So I'm wondering, and this is for any of you, but maybe let's start with Mark and work backwards this way. What are some steps we might take to address this challenge? Is this a challenge that needs to be addressed, or are there other systems through which we should be operating here?
So when I went to work in Congress, I'd already had my PhD. I was like, oh, I'm a PhD. Like I can go teach some congressmen and women how all this should work, right? And then you get in and you're a staffer, and you're one of 6 people handling all of federal policy for a Congress member who's dealing with what I call like 24/7 media trench warfare. Dealing with every bill that's coming down, dealing with anything that's on the news, dealing with anything that our president tweets on a daily basis. The federal government is huge. The reason they're not necessarily addressing Facebook or a lot of these things, certainly there's lots of lobbying going on, certainly there's lots of money at hand, but it's also because they also have to make sure the federal budget gets passed. They have to make sure the Department of Defense is still operating, that grants from NSF are still going out, right? There are lots of things, trade deals are still happening or not happening. So the idea, I think, for when we're interested in how do we get lawmakers to care, it's not, I think if you go in with a sort of, a deficit model, if only they were smarter, I don't think that's the way it's really going to work. How the most motivating thing that ever got my boss or a lot of representatives to make change was when people came to see them in person. People came into their office, looked them straight in the eye, as we saw with our presentation earlier, which is kind of perfect. When you look someone in the eye and say, what you're doing is harming me, that is an extremely powerful perspective. And so I think it's all about grassroots organizing, people, tech workers making a symbol, a signal to the representatives of their policymakers that even the tech workers are upset. And I think you can start to send signals that way, but I think in terms of policy, I don't think it's a deficit model, as much as I didn't like a lot of the senator and House members' questions either. It's about organizing and coalition building to force them to engage with you.
And I would agree with quite a bit of that. First, I think rest assured there are organizations that are out there that are balanced, that are nonpartisan, that are doing their part to educate our leadership at the federal level about technology and privacy issues. So that is happening. However, and certainly having done a good deal of government relations work at the state level, I would say for all of us in the room, I would ask the question, when is the last time, or have you ever called up and made an appointment with your state or local rep and walked in the door and said, hi, I'm a voter in your district and these are the issues that I care about? Because the truth of the matter is that while we may look at our legislators and think, why aren't you doing something about this? That what they know is the first story that walks in the door. So if your perspective is the first story that walks in the door, that's going to be their perspective until someone else walks in the door and they get a little balance and shape to it. But we don't see them moving actively around certain issues because A, there are a lot of issues that they're responsible for addressing, and B, they're trying to represent you, particularly at the state and local levels. And the question I would pose to you is your voice being heard? There's, and we see it particularly here in New York, right? There's a lot of protests, we're out on the street, we're marching, we've got placards. That's all well and good. Pick up the phone, make an appointment, go sit down for 20 minutes with your local rep. You will have more impact there than anywhere else on the shape of what comes next.
I agree with both of that. Coalitions, relationship building. One of the quotes that I really love is this idea that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I want to provide a few examples where we're actually seeing law and technology come together, just from my perspective as a legal engineer. One example is this group that we're actually involved with called the Alliance for Innovative Regulation. And what a group called Alliance for Innovative Regulation. And that's associated with another group called the FinReg Lab. And that's a coalition of policymakers deep in the field with technologists and other congressional officials. And that really is thinking about new models around how law and technology can. One example is that we participate in something called the Tech Sprint with the Bank of England and other financial regulators to think about how do we start thinking about machine readable regulation and how that intersects with financial regulation to make it easier for governments to understand how to keep companies accountable around various types of regulations. So there's active work being done to think about how do we start bridging that conversation between law and code so that policymakers can actively enforce and catch problems before they become a big problem. The second is that we just need more research and development. I think that's something that we're not thinking enough here, is this idea that we need research and development to the concept of democracy itself. How do we think about bringing people, different stakeholders, to do democracy better? How do we make sure that people are getting involved around making the regulatory process more efficient and more transparent? How do we get involved in trying to think about making our government work more effectively? And one example around this that's really fascinating is Estonia's work. Estonia, there's a fantastic article in the New Yorker about what Estonia is doing. It has its problems, but one of the things that it's really known for is that 99% of its services is actually digital. So it's known to be able to do your tax returns in 5 minutes. You can start a corporation in 10 minutes. They have one of the strongest levels of cybersecurity in the world. They're a top-ranked leader. And just that effectiveness around being able to monitor compliance issues and ethical issues is, far and away many other governments of the world. And so I think there's interesting things happening around the world to think about, hey, policymakers don't have to be behind. how do we build those coalitions so that we have the right partnerships at the table, we have the right stakeholders, including vulnerable communities at the table, to make sure that we're using technology in the right way and help people get the services they need faster and safely.
Great. Thank you all. Before I ask my next question, can you in the back hear everything we're saying? Is volume good? Sort of? Okay. Well, we'll try to speak up. Thanks. So a lot of what we're saying, a lot of what I'm hearing you saying is getting at this topic that came up the last time we all spoke, which was this idea of a technological civil rights movement. And this idea that so many new technologies, next generation technologies, really have significant civil rights implications, whether that's facial recognition, surveillance technology, biased algorithms, things of this nature. Given that, it can maybe be surprising that we're not seeing necessarily people walking into their representatives' offices and pushing them on these issues, or we are seeing, as was mentioned earlier, corporate walkouts, but not necessarily demonstrations on the scale of what some of us in this room might like to see, given how significant some of these issues are. So what do some of you think are some of the barriers to civic action amongst everyday people who are being affected by these technologies? What are some of those barriers towards civic action, and what types of civic action would you really like to see to move the needle?
This is like right. This is exactly why I went to law school. It's exactly for this reason. One of the biggest barriers, I would say, is that although many of the people in this room may work in technology, they may see certain aspects of technology as daunting, but generally they're conversant in it. They feel comfortable. You're here. A lot of the communities that are being affected by this, whether it be minority communities, whether it be people who don't as much means, people in rural areas, however you want to slice that, it's scary. It's intimidating. When governments are using this, or even corporations are using technology to make decisions about people's lives, welfare, predicting bail, predicting criminality, things like that, it's intimidating because we come up in a culture where, technology can predict anything. It can find you a date, it can find you a car, it can find all kinds of things. Maybe it can figure this out. And so it can be very intimidating to a lot of people to even start to critique it, because when the opposing party, as often happens with major companies, they'll bring in this like fancy PhD technologist and they'll say, everything you're critiquing about our system, you don't know what you're talking about. But they do know what they're talking about. They're at the tip of the spear. They're the people being actually affected by this. So I think intimidation, either self-imposed or people imposing it upon them, is a big deal. What can we do about it? I'll just come back to, I think, coalition building. I've been reading a lot of stuff about the civil rights movement in terms of how it actually was built. And so people talking about the civil rights movement just afterwards talked about, even Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail talked about how self-interest is the most important thing you can do in a coalition. You have to convince a bunch of people who are very different that is in their own individual self-interest to be a part of this coalition. So people who were workers' rights parties, people in the South, people in the North, bringing them all together and saying, actually, all of this matters to all of you, and you better join my coalition because that's the only way we're actually going to solve anything. And so I think what technologists can do, or people interested in this problem can do, is find those coalitions, find the idea that privacy concerns are related to race relations, are related to cybersecurity, are related to safety concerns. All of these, if we can bring all of these into a single coalition, there are tons of groups out there concerned about all these different aspects, but to show that actually they're all intertwined, form that kind of coalition, I think that's one of our means forward.
I think in general, people are a little bit overwhelmed by technology, overwhelmed by the idea that they might be able to impact how technology companies operate. It's become so ubiquitous in our lives. We're all attached to our devices, and young people are as well. And so this idea that I think general consumers have a growing awareness that there is an impact of our technology use, of data collection, that perhaps we are only just starting to come to terms with and only just starting to recognize. But it's there and it's growing. We have things like the New York Times Privacy Project, which, you know, if anything, if there's something that is done more to raise consumer awareness that privacy is a thing. I may not be able to define it, I may not really understand or have fully articulated its impact on me, but I know it's a thing I should be thinking about. You know, that is sort of my version of proof that we've raised the consciousness level, that something's happening here. The significance of what's happening here, I think we're only just starting to come to terms with. But at the same time, I think we need to start thinking about data as currency and thinking about this idea of being conscious about where we spend our currency, the same way we do our dollars, and where we're very mindful of spending our money with companies that are behaving in certain ways, that are socially responsible, that are not misbehaving. We need to start doing the same thing with our information currency. And in terms of the impacts and how we see what we can do about it, and you know, I would say in the education sector, in the K-12 education sector, I see this playing out almost every day. Tremendous amount of technology being used in K-12 school systems these days. The schools look nothing like they did when even many of you were in school. And what we see right now, just as a small example, is in a rush to protect students, to solve the school safety problem. We see a lot of tech coming in. We see a lot of AI. We see a lot of facial recognition with no actual proof or evidence that it is improving anything on the safety front. We see massive databases. The state of Florida has got a massive database they are building with student data. You know, who's been bullied, who's self-identified as transgender, who has been subject to a forced mental health commitment. All that data is being gathered into a database in the name of safety. And what we see is tremendous outrage from the privacy community. There are some of us policy wonks, we're in the privacy community, there are a lot of organizations, but also parents who are really pushing back on this. And it is an example of grassroots movement that is maybe not changing the effects yet, maybe not changing what's happening, but is raising significant questions and making it excruciatingly painful for some of these states and some of these districts to bring in technology that maybe is not proven out as being more beneficial than harmful. So that idea that we can make a difference, that it doesn't take, and this is not necessarily, there are not necessarily coalitions that are doing this. This is, you know, sometimes, in some cases, it's one parent advocate or 3 parent advocates who are causing that disruption. And so part of the message here is that we can and should build coalitions when we have interest, but also that we can all let our voice be heard. One of the benefits of social media is that we don't have to have our name in the New York Times anymore to make an impact, right? We can send out a tweet and, you know, and make an impact and cause disruption. And I'm also reminded that the change in how technology is built and used and leveraged, that it doesn't come from within, right? Disruption comes from outside looking in and saying, I have an idea for doing it differently, for doing it better. And that is really, there's tremendous opportunity for someone to be doing it differently and someone to be doing it better than it is now. And we do see that tide is turning in that direction.
So 2 thoughts come to mind, 2 examples. So on this idea of research and development around democracy, to this question around how do we build power amongst communities, I want to bring up this example of Porto Alegre's community participatory budgeting project. It's something that a lot of people don't know about, but essentially what happened in Brazil is that the mayor decided that 15% of this budget would be sent and decided upon and upvoted by the residents themselves. And there was explicit outreach towards vulnerable communities, providing things like childcare, education. And what was really fascinating is that people turned out in droves, realizing that this was a rare opportunity to actually control their purse strings. And then secondly, the World Bank actually identified that infant mortality rates decreased by 20%. in the few years that this was implemented. Investment into affordable housing tripled. Sewage lines increased by the thousands. And I think it's movements like this that we think, like, how do we do democracy differently so that we actually invest in people? Governments are actually putting money where their mouth is to invest in participation, especially working with vulnerable communities so that they can build those coalitions. Super critical, and I think the participatory budgeting process is a really interesting example that we can learn from, and how do we build upon that using technology? Not everyone has the time towards what you're signaling is that not everyone has the time to go talk to the congressional representative. If you're a low-income worker, you might be working 5 different jobs with lots of unflexible schedules. Like, can you really make the time? And plus, you might not even know how to navigate sort of the language and cultural barriers to do that. But there are actually spaces that encourage working with vulnerable communities to be able to do that so that they have a power. If they're actually going out, the money and the voting that they're doing actually will lead to a tangible difference in their lives. Yes, they're going to turn out, and that's what we saw in the community budgeting process. The second aspect is this idea of how do we create new governance structures? I think in addition to people, we also have to think about corporate incentives. And one example of this is there's 2 examples. One is this idea of how do we challenge the business model of a company being purely about shareholder interest? There's been a fascinating conversation by actually billionaires, ironically, by the Business Roundtable, talking about, hey, should the purpose of a business only be for short-term shareholders? Should it also be formally for planet, for vulnerable communities, for employees? Like, does it actually make sense for fiduciary duties to just simply be towards these short-term shareholders who often tend to be, the 1% of the 1%? The second aspect of this is this idea of an information fiduciary. And this was, really advocated by law professors at Harvard and Yale. And it's sort of this idea that, hey, actually, can we think of a different model for internet companies that actually aligns free speech rights with the protections of individuals? So this goes beyond like GDPR and CCPA. It draws from long-standing tradition and professional codes of conduct that doctors and lawyers are actually having to abide by. And what this says is that there's duties of care and other types of duties of loyalty, to make sure that these information fiduciaries like Facebook, Twitter, they have a legal responsibility to not actually use that information in ways that will harm you. And the reason it actually advocates and pushes free speech rights, there's a fascinating case by the NAACP, obviously a legal professional organization, when the state tried to compel the NAACP to release all this information about who was part of this so that they could discriminate against them, create a backlash. They were able to win a case in the Supreme Court under this sort of fiduciary model to say, hey, we don't actually have to disclose this information because it's part of our professional duty to represent their free speech rights so that they can critique the government. And they won that case. And so there's longstanding tradition of this idea of a fiduciary that's in medical and legal fields that we can actually impose upon the governance ideas around technology companies so that their interests actually align with the interests of their key stakeholders. And I think that's a really key thing, is that right now the interests are often not aligned fundamentally. We really have to question that.
Can I just to add on to some of the discussion of like these grassroots and like getting diversity and going out and meeting these communities. I really loved Dr. Cogburn's start this morning, where she talked about empathy is insufficient, diversity is insufficient, things like this. There's a lot of, you can only read so many books, you can only read so many articles, you can only follow so many people on Twitter. Go to them. Go to them. Go to whatever your technology, rather than bringing in stakeholders, go to where they are, is what I'm trying to say. So you're a company that's developing, I don't know, let's say like an algorithm that can predict abuse and neglect in households. New York City's developing one right now. It has all kinds of issues, all kinds of questions about bias and racism and classism, etc. Those people have never been to family court. Go to family court. Go to Harlem where I worked. Go see these families. See how it's affecting them. That's more than empathy, I think. That's more than reading a book. That's more than the notions of ethics. You'll actually see how it's applied to you. So I think rather than, it's important to bring people in, but I think also being the person who's going to go see them, I think, is a powerful statement, and also an incredible learning experience as well when you're developing the policy. Go to a school. You may think that your school, that it's just like when you were a kid, but maybe it's completely different now, And that's a way to inform your advocacy.
And just to build on that, I think ideally you go to them and benefit them. Because their time is valuable. As I brought up this example of a low-wage worker, their schedules are extremely unpredictable. They might be commuting several hours a day. And I think what's really interesting about the budgeting process is that there was a tangible benefit associated with that. If you came, you might actually be able to get more affordable housing. How do you create these processes, or like legal aid? If you actually go to them, you're providing a tangible legal service or education. You can't just expect to go up to their front door and ask them to give you time. It's also how do you provide that situation where you're actually helping to save them time, address key problems in their life, and that really starts with empathy as well, but it can't stop with empathy. It has to actually also add with action, actually helping their life, save their time, add value to their life. You can't just expect them to meet you.
And also make sure you're learning as much as you're doing. We need to go in not with a presumption that we can help, but to learn and understand the problem. This comes up quite a bit. I have a lot of privacy conversations and do a lot of privacy work in K-12 education and going into public schools. And we have all sorts of conferences and panels and discussions and one-on-one sessions with technologists in schools to talk about how they can protect the privacy of student data. And I'm often reminded of something that was shared by a woman, technologist, on a panel around this topic. And we were really deep into the mix of how do you protect student data privacy. And she stood up and said, this is a very privileged problem. Because what I do in my school is try to make sure the parents sign the form so we can feed their kids lunch, right? And that's my biggest problem. So as you're going in, right, we need to learn as much as we're doing and make sure we're not going in with a presumption of, I have something that can help you, versus let me learn where your pain points are. How can I help you? Where would you like me to be best positioned to support what you're doing? And that's where the magic happens.
Yep.
That's great. Thank you all. I want to open it up now for audience questions. We'll take some from the audience, and then we'll come back here for closing comments from our panelists. But I want to make sure we get to some of the things that you all are really wondering about. I saw one over here.
Kevin Bryan, Keystone Policy Center. You talk about, so I don't approach this as a technologist. I approach this as someone who does collaborative problem solving for a living. So when you start to talk about building coalitions, grassroots organizing, could each of you give me one specific coalition or issue where we ought to be doing, or that my organization ought to be getting people to start to focus on?
I can bring up an example. So something I care a lot about, what I study in my PhD is affordable housing. And one of the aspects that I really, really find important here is this idea of new coalitions being built. So there's a really fascinating case study in Minneapolis where they're one of the first cities to roll back exclusionary zoning. And for those that are not familiar with the concept of exclusionary zoning, it's where you have minimum set square footage for housing. You need to have a full car garage. In some cases, you might even need a pool. And all these sort of requirements actually drive up the cost of housing, because in a single plot of land, that means you can only build one 3,000 square foot house, not maybe like 4 really efficient well-designed houses, or even a fourplex or a duplex. And that's really important because you can't build affordably by design. It's forcing privilege, and it's forcing cost into the way that we're building a lot of houses in high opportunity neighborhoods with access to good school districts. What was really critical in the Minnesota case, in the Minneapolis case, is that it was one of the first times there was a coalition being built between what's called the Yes in My Backyard movement, which tends to be more of a privileged, overwhelmingly white group that might often have tech backgrounds, with racial justice and tenant advocate organizations, with labor union organizations, with the coalition, new progressive city leaders being elected in the Minneapolis government, city government. And this sort of, after lots and lots of, going back to this idea of like trying to understand empathy, trying to understand like what are people needing, what are they struggling with in their life, reaching out to people where they were, with these vulnerable populations, going to their churches, going to their the festivals, making sure that you were building those relationships over time. There's that educational component. They will have passed this landmark banning of exclusionary zoning that actually increased density in Minneapolis, which is facing a rent crisis like other cities around the world. And so I think this is an example where these coalitions have been really powerful. I recommend everyone to look at that case study in Minneapolis, because I think exclusionary zoning is one of the biggest issues currently around thinking about housing, which is the biggest cost for most Americans and can shut out, it's one of those keystone things that shuts out people from accessing opportunity, whether it's school, jobs, et cetera. And it just goes to the fabric of our design of our communities. And so we really have to think about things like exclusionary zoning, which prevents a lot of innovation around building more affordably.
I'm going to give 3 examples of issues where I don't think there are coalitions, and I think there should be, or that they're ripe for activity. One is school safety. There's a tremendous amount of federal and state money being thrown at the school safety problem with no actual thoughtful solutions. We're throwing tech at a problem, at a human problem. The other is, the second is no and low credit financial participation. So credit cards, bank accounts for people with no and low credit, which is critically important for young people, critically important for that economic participation in our world, frankly. And the third is, it gets called digital literacy, but teaching children, very young people, how to navigate the world that they are born into, which they know no world without technology. And they are not being taught in the home, in schools. They're taught a little bit in schools, but they're not being taught in the home from a very young age what it means to be online, safety, privacy, security, decision-making around your use of tech. And if we're not educating children, we don't solve any of these problems.
So if you want, I'll give a particularly dystopian one that needs some coalition building. So people have heard of like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, where people submit their saliva or something in order to get a DNA test, and that's supposed to build up family trees. It was used famously to catch the Golden State Killer out in California, and oh boy, what that set off. Now, 23andMe, if you look at actually who's in the database, it's largely upper middle class, high class people, largely white or Asian, but largely not people of color, Hispanics, African Americans. That's a problem, according to certain police departments, that, oh man, we want to use this for criminals, but it doesn't have all the criminals we want, right? So the NYPD has developed a task force that has built a DNA database. When you drink a cup of coffee, as I see people around here, and you throw it away in a garbage can, that's discarded property. The government can pick it up. They do DNA testing, and they're actually building in New York City and communities of color in particular, but generally, a DNA database. Yeah, I heard, oh, Jesus over there. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So this is being done right now. It only just got uncovered. It's actually been going on for 3 or 4 years. Again, the law moves slowly, right? So that's a huge one that's starting to build up. There's all kinds of various legal aid groups, Brooklyn Defenders, Legal Aid Society are coming out to fight against this. But the DNA database has already largely been developed. It's already being used to track people, building up family trees of entire communities of color in Brooklyn, Northern Manhattan, Bronx. So that one is there's going to be a big coalition forming, but it's just now starting. And that's one to be particularly concerned about.
And there was just a case in Florida, the judge sort of permitted law enforcement to, I think it was 23andMe or Ancestry, one of those, to turn over their records.
Yeah. So now if you have the database yourself, you don't even worry about 23andMe, you have it yourself.
Thank you.
Great. I saw it in the back first.
Daniel, you mentioned this fiduciary strategy for regulating technology, and I think it seems to hold a lot of promise. I've just been reading about it in the past year or so.
Yeah.
And it's clear that we can't really leave it up to themselves. So it seems a very smart strategy. Are the technology companies, of course they suss this out, are they starting to disrupt this in any way? What's the technology company reaction to this this, what I consider a smart strategy?
So from my understanding, I can't say that I know all the technology companies' reaction to this, but I think they're barely, one litmus test is that they're barely starting to think about the national federal privacy law that's extremely weakened compared to GDPR, which is the EU's privacy law. There's a lot of exceptions to the one that the Internet Association has proposed. You can see a lot of really interesting critiques of it by the Electronic Freedom Foundation. There's a vigorous debate, so they're barely thinking about that. I don't think that they're at the stage right now to think about critiquing fiduciary duties. They're not at the stage right now to think about critiquing information like should they be a fiduciary and have these duties, new duties of care and loyalty that are existing in the legal and medical profession. So that would be my reaction, is that maybe with the exception of maybe some more enlightened or more progressive technology companies, I doubt that it's even sort of they're there yet. That would be my guess. What's up?
They're not trying to block it yet? It seems the best way in.
It's not hasn't even been a proposal. It's really kind of like R&D legal professors talking about like how do we reimagine balancing free speech rights with duties to stakeholders. This is just simply, it's like an article that's been released in the last 5 to 10 years, so it hasn't really been translated.
The Center for Humane Technology has taken up that mantle.
Yeah.
And I always wonder, why are they talking about us with these Paleolithic brains and these godlike powers of technology companies, which I take offense to and think is wrong.
Yeah.
But that's wrong, because that's the groundwork for making this.
100% agree. 100% agree. We need to think about more proposals like that. Are you with CHT?
No,
Oh, okay.
I'm Tracy Dennis, I'm a psychology professor.
Oh, okay, cool, fantastic. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, no, of course.
Great. Over here.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One, I have been a law professor, and I was at Legal Aid for a number of years. And I want to know what the four of you think of actually sitting down and writing a code of ethics, just like the ABA has, or similar to the, what I have to do as a lawyer, which is have a credential, have a degree, have continuing legal education. Is there anything at NYU? I mean, I'm on the board of a program at Cardozo. And when we talk about technology, the kids are talking about getting jobs in technology. They're not talking about creating an ethical framework. So the group that I'm working with called Pivot for Humanity is actually trying to get you guys to sit down and start writing it. Start writing that code of ethics, rather than just talking about it. So can I recruit the four of you?
Absolutely.
Have coffee at my loft?
Depends what kind of coffee.
Okay.
Instant coffee or
space, but the group that I'm volunteering with, and I think what you said about maybe a business who has all these credentialed people, like doctors who have, degrees and sign up for do no harm.
Right.
Maybe they'll do better than a company that doesn't have people signed up.
And we have precedent for that too.
So tell me, is there a group besides Pivot for Humanity that's actually sitting down and writing, even if we're wrong, even if the first sentence is wrong? And by the way, New York State is one of the few states, progressive states, that does not have privacy laws. And the New York Civil Liberties Union is taking that on right now. But come on, can you come over to the law?
Absolutely.
It's so hard. When I lost school,
so
that's so ready. Or get NYU.
Yeah, I would say, they do.
But is it law technology?
It is by Jason Schultz, who's awesome. But I would say to the well, what I would suggest to you is I think there's been an explosion of ethical principles and rules that have been posited, even by major Center for Responsible AI. Facebook has some, and the issue that I think someone yesterday was talking about it at there was like a pre-meeting here, where ethics washing. Like maybe I'll let him talk about it, but ethics can only sort of go so far. Especially when the people, it's almost like a self-regulating situation, a self-ethics situation. So what I would posit is that ethics need to be translated into rules and standards that if you breach, fiduciary, etc. So I think we need to translate it into actual rules, regulations. So I come from like the aviation community, And it's not a choice. Well, Boeing made some bad choices recently, tragic choices recently, but that's because they were breaking how aerospace systems are supposed to be built, and they're breaking federal law, all kinds of things. So we need to start thinking about, okay, we have these ethics, how do we write them into rules? Where does that translation come from? I think that's the biggest thing. Like, what rule do you set for a K-12 privacy? What's a really good one? I was learning from Lynette, there are like 120 different sets of them. So how do you integrate them? How do we develop these actual rules?
Yeah.
Well, in children's media, we see the UK has put together a code of design conduct that is enforceable and is in development, and is essentially fundamental principles that have existed in the US around children's design for 50, 60 years. So there's nothing, and I think we would probably see the same with any kind of general audience design code of conduct. There's nothing new about the ideas that are being put forth to do no harm. The question is, where are those companies and there are many companies, when we talk about tech companies, we tend to then focus on the behemoths, right? We're talking about Google and Facebook and these companies, but there are many, many companies that are doing right and doing good, and we need to also do more to talk about them, to celebrate them, to promote them, and to spend there. Spend our currency, spend our dollars there to signal to the markets what matters to us.
Yeah. There's just about 5 minutes left, and I know there's someone in the back who's been waiting to ask a question, I think.
I wanted. Do you mind if I just quickly?
Yeah,
make
just real quick, sure.
Just really quickly, if anyone is interested, so I started assembling this called the One-Pager's Newbie Guide to Data Ethics, and I've listed over six different data ethics codes that have been implemented, and also various rules and principles, all the way from the National Institute of Standards and Technology to FTC, sort of ways of thinking about it. So there are a spectrum around data ethics codes, all the way to actual privacy principles that are being used by the FTC. Happy to share that, just feel free to reach out. You can just find me on my LinkedIn, but I think it's a fantastic question. But right now the question, to your point, is that there's been an explosion of ethical codes, but there's different levels of enforcement around that, and we really have to think about how do principles like this information fiduciary principle can actually put some teeth behind some of these codes.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Going back to the idea of going to stakeholders, learning about their needs, and way back to the beginning, a couple of you talked about starting with the user and having values-driven approaches. So the entire fields of human-centered design and UX are supposed to be doing that, and there's been this journey of progressively making their way into large organizations and making their way up to the C-suite. Why do you think those fields have failed to really introduce this paradigm change when they've been already working at it?
Yeah. So my PhD is in cognitive engineering, which is sort of a branch of HCI, human factors, all of that. And I would say typically what happens is there's user interface design, UX, which is we would be engineers and call them shapes and colors. So you're a little diminutively, but often that's because the human-centered design and human factors, cognitive engineering, we talk about it as it'd be sprinkle dust after the system's already been developed. So they actually didn't develop the system with HCI in mind. They built it to whatever they wanted it to be. And they're like, oh, well, can we make the user be able to understand it, how the system is working? Not, does the user even want this system? Is this even good for the system or good for the actual problem you're solving? So they're not, I think, using human-centered design in its truest form, at least the companies that we're concerned about. The good companies, I think, do. They actually go to the users. That's where you get your requirements and you build from there. But I think a lot of times HCI, all of these even ethical principles are after it's been built and deployed and committed. And so I think it's almost like the order of operations is a problem.
Great. All right, let's end with the speed round here. Just a couple minutes left, but maybe 20 to 30 seconds each. What's a thought or a question that we haven't been able to get to today that you feel is really important that you want people to leave here with?
Yeah, happy to start. So I think one thing we really need to do is, I would just want to re-highlight something that Ryan brought up, is that we have to think about what's already working. That idea of data and theory and build upon what's already working. One thing that I often see, not only in the sort of city and affordable housing space, but also in the technology space, is that there's so many new shiny objects out there. There are new things that seem feasible, that seem cool from first principles, but how do we actually build upon and translate academic research, data-driven design, talking to vulnerable stakeholders, and seeing like what's actually working, how do we build and scale that? And there's a lot of different, that's part of the one pager, is that I sort of list some of those resources, and again, happy to share that. But it's like, how do we build upon what's already working, synthesize, bring together a storage of knowledge, because everyone, this is a very new field. How do we start making sure people know like this is what exists? Let's come to a consensus. Let's start adding new things as they arise so we can start building upon and strengthening the coalitions that we need to build in this space.
I would echo that a little bit, and I want to sort of end. There's not a lot that's new in the field of ethics, design ethics. It's new to our industry, right? It's new to our sector. Certainly working in the youth space, I see it all the time, companies coming in, you know, I've got this great new tech for young people. I'm like, yeah, you forgot the 60 years of concern and rules and laws around this. So make sure that you're taking that historical perspective, that you know what's come before, and learn what worked, what didn't work, how to leverage it. And as you go through the day, you already heard this morning some great inspiring talks. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more. What I always encourage at an event like this is think about what is the action I'm going to take when I go home. I took a lot of notes, but what's the thing I'm going to do? And move yourself into action.
Yeah, and I'll be brief here to follow up exactly that. Maybe the big change will happen when we change from talking about ethical design to just good design. As she was sort of pointing out, we know a priori these things are bad. We shouldn't be doing a lot of these things, Boeing's accident, autonomous vehicles accident, a lot of these privacy things. It doesn't actually take a lot of thought to realize these are things we either shouldn't be doing or should do with more care. And I think if we could frame this as not about your ethics or your morals, but just do good work. Even if you don't, let's say you don't care about ethics, just do the good work, and that should be more than enough. And hopefully we can get there in the coming years.
Great, thanks. Let's give our panelists a hand. Cool. Thank you all for joining us.